mai, hoki mai ki a The Fold. I mihi ne, ko Duncan Greive tōku ingoa. My guest today is it's a huge one. It's a get, well, for me, and I'm sure for listeners of this podcast. It's Shayne Currie, the media insider himself, the former managing editor of The Herald, former editor of The Herald and The Herald on Sunday, and deputy editor of the Sunday Star Times, a person, basically a print media lifer who spent the thick end of 20 years in various sort of senior editor or executive roles, and before earlier this year abruptly resigning to become a reporter again. And I think it was a kind of a quixotic move. It's not really what people tend to do from those positions, but he very quickly adopted this persona, media insider, for a column, which I remember seeing him out at an event the week it launched, and it was absolutely groaning with scoops. I think it was around the time that Today FM was melting down, and I said to him, I was like, "You can't keep this up, mate. Like we're living through a very kind of tight period of a lot of stuff going on, but mostly it's boring." And he was like, "Oh, we'll see." And honestly, he's proven me dead wrong. The Media Insider is a weekly column that comes out digitally on a Friday and mostly runs in the weekend Herald on a Saturday, and it's made up of these kind of a few different pieces. There's normally like a chunky lead and then a few smaller stories out the back, but it is delicious, gossipy. He breaks stories in it quite regularly. It's I think by far the best media writing, particularly about journalism, but also about the industry more broadly, going in New Zealand now. And that's basically a function of him having been in these amazing roles for 20 years. He's gracious enough to kind of point to the Herald's newsroom in terms of putting him onto some stories, but you can really just feel how much he knows and what his contact book is like in terms of the shape of the column. There has been a sense that he is much more gentle on his employer, NZME, than on their fierce rival Stuff. That's entirely founded. The Stuff stories are reported with a level of glee that is borders on unseemly at times, and I'm sure has been pretty tough reading for people in staff management. But ultimately, we're all grown-ups here, and they have every facility. They also buy ink by the barrel. So, we'll have enjoyed reporting on the Herald's travails at various times. This is probably the way it will always be. I certainly would hope so. You have to read it through that lens, but if you do, it's just the most enjoyable thing to do on a Friday morning. But not only that, he's been writing stories, big scoopy stories for the Herald, and started a shameless rip-off of The Lunch with the FT period as a sort of an occasional running in print and online as well. Basically, he looks like he's having the absolute best time and is working seemingly about 36 hours a day. And I've really, really enjoyed watching Shayne, who's someone we've dealt with as the Spinoff has had business relationships with the Herald off and on for most of the time we've been around. Shayne's always been really decent to me, even at times when I've written things which I'm sure, much as Stuff have been annoyed with him, I'm sure he's been annoyed with me, and that's all of us just sort of doing our jobs, I guess. But just a terrific guy and a really good sport, I think, in this interview. It won't be for everyone, but if you read the column, or if you're interested in the kind of the way that the media is evolving, and the kind of the sort of gossip and rivalries and tactical plays that ultimately power this business, then it's a great column, and hopefully this is a great listen. So this is Shayne Currie, the Media Insider, on The Fold. Huge day. Got the Media Insider himself, Shayne Currie. Welcome to The Fold.
Thanks very much, Duncan. The cross-fertilisation, a Media Insider and The Fold. It's been a long time coming.
The people have been baying for it, and the day's finally arrived. I'm thrilled about it. And but I wonder if we could start right at the start for you, and if you could just tell me basically how you got into this terrible situation that we call journalism. Your way into this trade.
Yeah, well, I still remember the day at Tauranga Boys College where I was sitting in English class and journalism was offered as a sixth form subject. It was in the fifth form at the time, and a light went off for me. It was as simple as that journalism was suddenly being offered as a subject in the following year.
It's amazing to think of that as part of the curriculum.
And I thought, that's me, because I loved English and I loved things like geography and a little bit of history. I hated maths. And anyone who's worked with me in the last couple of decades will know that budgets are not my strong point. And so, but certainly the written word and language was of huge interest to me. We had a famous newspaper at Tauranga Boys College called the Hillsdean Reflector, and I became editor of that the following year as well. And that was famous for over many years, over many decades, correctly polling the boys at the school and predicting the election outcome every 3 years. So, it was, I think, in 1987, and we correctly predicted the
Calder election.
Well. Yeah, and that got a few national headlines for that as well. So fun days, and then moved into ATI Journalism School in 1989 under Jim Tucker and Jeff Black and Susan Boyd Bell, famous names in New Zealand journalism.
So was it always print for you? Were you a consumer of any other kind of media?
Yeah, all news really, and has been the case ever since. Obviously newspapers early on were very much my bread and butter, and the written form, but that's evolved over time. But certainly television news back in the day and radio news on the hour, news junkie, still am, and very much now in that digital mindset, story first mindset, and knowing we've got so much data available, right, in terms of what we know, what the audience is, how they're reading and watching and listening, that we just didn't have that back in the early 90s and through even in the early days of the internet. Amazing.
I guess you just had how'd the front page go at newsstands kind of thing was the big...
That's right.
You'd get data point.
And you'd get the data 2 or 3 days later. And for the dailies, that was often too late. The weeklies, it was okay. But it was journalistic instinct and, sort of lick your finger and put it to the wind. And we think this story might go well. And I think, unfortunately, that saw the demise of quite a few newspapers in the day because they weren't really reflecting audience demand or audience interest.
It's funny. I mean, just to quickly as an aside, we get more feedback than ever now. I would argue too much in the social media era, and often there are these sort of critiques of stories that become kind of memes. So the 24-year-old has got 3 houses, and the business owner moving to Australia is the current one. But my answer to that is always that is ultimately a reflection of audience demand. There are more stories like that because people are reading the ones that are up there. Is that true, or to what extent is the homepage of the Herald now a product of a sort of demand, or what the actual kind of fundamental news moment?
It's a combination of both, and always will be. But you've got to also remember that top half of the Herald homepage is 15 stories. Now, the Herald produces 250 stories a day, and so not all of them are going to feature in that top half of the Herald homepage. We have started personalising some of the spots there, so you will now be being delivered stories in a couple of those spots that others aren't getting delivered, and that's based on your reading history and your interests. And we also have a recommendation spot, which is also bespoke to you personally. And so what we're trying to do, without being an echo chamber, but actually start to personalise that homepage a little more. So if you do hate that story about the 24-year-old and you haven't clicked on it previously, you won't get served a similar story.
I mean, that's ultimately like a sort of a TikTokification of news, like a For You page.
Yeah.
Because the thing is...
But being careful about it.
Yeah.
We don't want it to be, truly, fully personalised. We do think that there still has to be that journalistic instinct, the importance of the news agenda and delivering views and opinions and news that you might not necessarily like or agree with, but we think is important.
I totally agree. One thing that's quite interesting about that for me is that that's been a long kind of running, this is very niche, but it's a niche podcast, so we're fine. But critique of the media, that it hasn't sort of embraced the sort of technology to allow for that kind of thing. But then, I'm sure you are, a voracious reader of the New York Times, and it always surprised me the extent to which their mobile app homepage, which I assume is pretty, one of, if not the most highly trafficked part of what they do, it's the same stories, and they run for like 24 hours. In fact, it moves much more slowly than either Stuff or the Herald's homepage, and they'll run a story for 3 days. So. And they've got I think over 1,000 devs. Like if an organisation at that scale isn't moving heavily into personalisation, there sort of has to be a reason for it. And I think some of that is, Solzberg wrote a very good essay recently about having sort of standing up for what is what news is in a way that. The kind of social platforms can never compete with, and that ultimately sort of feels like it's part of what you're doing with Media Insider, which we'll talk about later.
Yeah, and having now gone back to the front line, I guess, of writing and reporting, I've taken a view that we do have to actually slow down on that homepage a lot more and keep the in-depth premium material there, and we maybe can tap into this as well. But those premium stories do stay on. Some of them stay on the homepage for 24 hours, sometimes even longer on a weekend. Especially if they're obviously drawing in subscribers and engaging subscribers. So in that respect, so around half the stories at the moment are premium stories in that top 15. They tend to have less churn. They stay around for much longer, whereas the free stories tend to be more breaking news, fast developing stories, and so by naturally do sort of get turned over a lot more quickly.
I think, and I want to get into some of kind of the how the homepage functions for the Herald in a bit, but let's just sort of jump back into, I think, a pretty pivotal moment for you that you were right up close with was the launch of the Herald on Sunday, which, that was probably the last major newspaper title launched in New Zealand. And, you were deputy editor, I think, from launch. It pulled you away from, the company that is now known as Stuff and to what is now a 20-year career at NZME. Do you want to talk about... And it contained, innovations. It was a tabloid format for a Sunday, for a quality Sunday paper. Tell me about what it was like to kind of figure out a newspaper sort of on the fly, how it interacted with the rest of the Herald and what you learned through that process.
Yeah, well, it was a hugely exciting project, and this is back in 2004. So, Facebook really was only just starting. Social media wasn't really... We had MySpace. That was it, I think. At the Herald itself, there was separate kind of the Herald. There was online, but that was a separate department on a separate floor. I'd spent 15 years at Fairfax, and previous to that, INL, as you say, eventually became Stuff. And I'd become the deputy editor of the Sunday Star Times, and there were a few changes there and a few changes happening at what was then APN, including the development of the Herald on Sunday. I didn't actually know what the project was when I was first approached about it. I made to sign NDA and so forth, but hugely exciting. And just to give you the sort of the level of investment that the company was making in it, we were tasked, the first very few editors who were brought on board, there were about 3 or 4 of us, to find 40 staff within about 4 or 5 weeks.
Phenomenal. I mean, the scale of the journalism industry in New Zealand then versus now.
Totally. I mean, 40 staff to put out. We didn't have to worry about online. That was a separate department, as I say. So all of our journalism was handled digitally by another department. These 40 staff were completely focused on putting out one edition of one newspaper every weekend.
And there was nothing to do with the Weekend Herald, nothing to do with the Daily.
That's right. And in fact, we were in separate physical buildings. Now, in hindsight, you look back on it, I think APN did actually want it to be kind of a separate organisation almost, or a separate newsroom, definitely. We were probably considered barbarians at the gate by the traditional Herald newsroom in those days and by APN, because we were purposely brought in to break, I guess, the 6-day Herald. They didn't want it to be a 7th day of what people had already seen. It had to be kind of a more middle market, compact newspaper. That was ingrained in us, not the T word, compact, not tabloid. newspaper to come in and try to find that middle market between the Sunday Star Times, the broadsheet as it was then, and the Sunday News. All good in theory, but it took a good year to really find its feet in the market.
It was quite interesting, you know. I never worked there, but sort of read it. But it did feel like it was a sort of a different part of the market too. The Herald was the sort of, you know, there was the kind of Granny Herald nickname that it had, and the Sunday Star Times had tried to basically occupy that sort of seventh day that the Herald had left there. And you know, one of the kind of ways that you could really feel the difference was Rachel Glusina was she was founding or
came in, yeah, she came in a little bit later actually. I mean, the whole philosophy behind it was we saw the Sunday Star Times as a broadsheet in those days, its circulation was increasing every audit period to, by the time I'd left as deputy editor, it reached about 220,000, I think. And the advertising market was growing, and I think APN quite clearly saw the opportunity there to have a decent bite of that pie. But yes, in terms of the content mix to start with, in that first 6 months, I mean, we'd done a lot of research with the marketing team at the Herald, and in terms of the design and the kind of market that it was pitched at. And unfortunately, there were quite a few, I guess, there were hits and misses, and there were quite a few misses in that first year. And I include the time when I was editor, and it wasn't until we started trialling a few different things on the front page and a bolder design, less text. It was simple things like that to capture the kind of retail market first and foremost, to try and build the circulation that way, because we had all the Herald subscribers. They were getting the seventh day as part of their 6-day or 5-day deal. So we were fine in that respect. We had to be a bit careful about brand values, but the retail was where we were focusing our early intentions.
That's where it was won and lost. But because, I mean, the reason I raised Glusina was that, you know, that was the Sunday Star Times had Bridget Saunders, who felt like, yeah, and it felt like, it's weird to think, like, is the social scene the same as it ever was? There just aren't people covering it, or was that a real moment that, you know, when you had the sort of Adam Pori, Matthew Ridge, Nikki Watson, Eric Watson, kind of like that whole, you know, era just felt, and they when you had the pair of them competing to cover it, it felt like a real moment. But gossip is next to news, but it's not quite the same thing. How, you know, as an editor, how did you sort of handle that aspect of it?
Yeah, and when I think back, you know, Rachel did play a big part in the kind of the news agenda as well. A lot of the material that she was uncovering did actually reach the front page or the news pages of the paper. I think we were in a time as well, I mentioned Facebook only just starting. I think we're in a time when television was still a big part of our lives, terrestrial television. So the likes of Ridge and Alice, Lana Cocroft, all these people were big celebrity names, and you didn't see them. Nowadays, that's kind of, there's been a kind of dissolution, I guess, of celebrity in a way, and that we see them all the time on TikTok or Twitter. Or
it's sort of flattened and expanded the market to the point where there are very few people who have the same cut through that they did then.
Totally. So it's very easy now for anybody to actually engage with a celebrity in quote marks, you know, whether that's through social media or what have you. Gossip still plays an important role for the, you know, the Herald on Sunday nowadays. Ricardo does a great job with Spy still. It's a lot softer, and I get that, and I get why. And you know, I've said publicly in the past that, you know, I put a lot of responsibility at my feet around some of the gossip pages back in the day. Just went a little too far.
What do you think kind of created the environment where some of those, you know, journalistic sort of scandals or getting close to the edge where it sort of came out of that era? Yeah,
I wrote recently about the John Manukea case, and you know, I look back at that. There's a lot of sadness about that case actually.
That was where, just if people who don't know, he basically fabricated an interview, and it turned out that there was more than that.
Quite a number, unfortunately, yes. And so, you know, I talked in the Media Insider column about sitting in the news meeting on a Tuesday morning and getting a phone call from John Hague QC.
It was a really powerful piece.
Because we'd thought that John Manukea had just secured an amazing interview in the previous weekend's newspaper with a disgraced police officer who'd been charged. And in fact, the entire interview was fabricated. And so John Hague, who represented the police officer, QC, ringing me saying my client's got an issue, and that he said he's never spoken to your reporter. So I spoke to the reporter there and then because we were in the news meeting, and he was adamant that the interview had occurred. There were notes from the so-called interview. I rang John Haig back feeling very, proud and chuffed that the reporter had notes.
The bullish editor.
Yeah. And later in the day, John called me back and said, no. And I said, well, the only way we can resolve this is if we get the two of them into the room and we sort this out. And so I went back out into the newsroom to find the reporter, and unfortunately he'd gone and we couldn't find him for another 4 or 5 days. And that obviously was an indication that all was not well. And in fact, you're right, we subsequently, as a result of an audit, we found other stories, and Fairfax, who had previously worked with, did the same and found a pattern there as well. So a terribly sad case, bad that it hadn't been picked up earlier. And of course, that led to all sorts of reviews and just the way but I think, the point I was trying to make, partly the point I was trying to make in that Media Insider article, and it came back to that, I was trying to draw it back to the recent RNZ digital journalist issue, is that you can have all the checks and balances in place in any newsroom or organisation. If that final set of eyes makes an error, whether that's intentional or otherwise, it's still going to lead to issues. And that really was one of the points I was trying to make. It's not fail-safe totally, when you're dealing with human behaviour.
But you think about the level of resourcing we had then versus now, you'd almost expect it to happen more, and it almost feels like it's happening less. And to my mind, it's a complicated thing. The impact of the shrinking of newsrooms on the quantity, quality, and sort of distribution of journalism. Someone on the podcast a few months ago was talking about the number of stories that were just generated for TV news that just would never aired, and there was nowhere else for them to go. And that it was an era of an abundance of talent and an absolute confined amount of space, and that's now sort of inverted in a way. How important was that that level of competition that existed then, between newspapers and news organisations to creating that sort of quite electric atmosphere of the era? Yeah,
look, I'm all for competition, and that was hugely competitive. And probably, in a print sense, in those days, the only really market where there was competition, APN and INL, as it was in those days, clearly had regional newspapers in different parts of the country, but none of them were really competing. And so the Sunday market was, very pointed, but that should never have been to the extent where, if that was causing issues within newsrooms around quality and trust. And as I say, I think the case of the John Manukea case, I think that was kind of more deeply rooted in other issues, sadly. But having said that, I look back on, the Herald on Sunday broke some amazing stories and has been the birthplace of many great journos. Many of their bylines are still around today in the Herald newsroom and beyond. And so I'm really proud of the team that we built up there. It was fun days. It was great days. And there was that kind of spirit that you just love every newsroom to enjoy at some point in your career. But but certainly I think we also had to be very careful that competition didn't lead to shortcuts or a lack of undermining quality and trust.
So it was a few years on. It's sort of a funny thing to think about the way that the internet sort of was at a slow drip, into the, because it impacts you in multiple different ways, right? Like there's an economic impact. There is a sort of where the breaking news power sits. There is a sort of a level of different sources of competition for different elements, but both in terms of the product and the advertising that fueled it. Was there a moment where you sort of thought, actually, hang on, this thing's really coming for us here? Or was it a sort of a slow drip where you just sort of woke up and things had changed?
Yeah, it was a slow drip. I think, we go right back to 1998 when NZHerald.co was created and stuff a couple of years later. And we've said in the past, and this is the same the world over, media owners and administrators, we made a huge mistake in terms of not putting a price point, some form of paywall or on that content at that time. But we were all in the arrogant belief that print would last forever. digital was not necessarily a passing phase, but would never overtake, the importance of print. How naive were we? But anyway, the slow drip did. I think it wasn't really, Duncan, until the early 2010s. And I actually remember I'd been crossed over into the Herald main newsroom by then as deputy editor and news editor, and I was looking after the nighttime shift. And I remember the next morning we were having a meeting to look at this new fandangled thing called a Herald app. So, and I looked at it I remember Kathy O'Sullivan presenting it, and it was amazing. And I thought that was probably one kind of trigger point. But it wasn't really then, and again, until 2014-15, when we brought the newsrooms fully together. That's the 3 newsrooms online, Daily Herald, Herald on Sunday, that it became a digital first, a truly kind of digital focused organisation.
And it's funny when you look at, that's one of the takeaways from RNZ. Just yesterday as we record this, they've kind of released their findings and said that, that's one of the issues they have is that they still, as of right now, have a radio newsroom and a digital newsroom, and that's where some of the issues came from. What was there resistance from the newsrooms in terms of that process?
I think what it was, we were operating in silos, so that we, the main engine room of the Herald, sure, their stories and photography and videos were being presented online, but not really being kind of given any kind of sense of audience size or engagement or times of day that people were reading. There was still very much a focus on 3 deadlines for print, and that the newsroom rosters were set up to that extent. And, there was still a lot of pride, still is to this day, about getting your name on the front page of the newspaper. That's still vitally important for a lot of journos, of course. But times have changed. We are now at a point now where we're story and audience first, and that's been through the shared knowledge of analytics and data. I agree with you that we can get swamped in that stuff from too much at times, but also knowing just how people are reading our content or watching it, getting better direction on would this be better as a podcast or better as a video rather than a 600-word story or a feature. And so we've had to take the newsroom along that. And I think the newsroom is now, one of the biggest challenges for any editor and leader these days is ensuring that journalists know the business of the company overall. I think sometimes journalists, whether it's through their own intentions or they've been kind of left out of the equation at times in terms of being shared some of the, the P&L lines even for the overall business, and letting them know just exactly how the businesses are faring.
So I want to, what we're coming up to, and that's a nice segue into your sort of your big change from earlier this year. But before then, I wanted to just sort of just talk about because the Herald's paywall effectively. And I remember one day, I feel like I encountered the paywall in the wild in like 2015. I swear I didn't hallucinate it. It was like a test registration kind of thing. And I couldn't replicate it. But there was a lot of rumor, and I don't even know if potentially Drennan might even have reported to the extent to which the paywall was sort of right there. And then I think maybe Jane Hastings potentially pushed it in another direction. How close did the Herald get prior to the sort of launch proper of the paywall? And do you sort of think back about, obviously you talked about the original sin of the free content in the 90s, but you basically don't learn. You start learning from the day that you launched the paywall. So had the Herald done it in 2014, 15, 16, things might be even further advanced than they are now.
Yeah, quite potentially. We looked at it on and off, and mainly on for a long time. And I think, I wasn't at the Herald myself at the time, but there was a kind of a foray into having columnists behind the paywall very early on, which didn't go so well. It was very leaky and easy to kind of to find that content. So that model didn't work very early on. But you're right, when Jane came in as CEO, yes, we looked at it very closely then, and there was a project underway. But at that time, just as we were bringing the newsrooms together and, with this new bold approach on digital and audience, there was also a market there for advertising. And so ensuring that we built up, I guess, the funnel as big as possible, the biggest, widest audience in as many years as we could before we started then venturing down the paywall route. So there was a deliberate strategy to keep it free for at least a few more years. So it wasn't really until obviously 2019 is when we pushed go, but there'd been probably a good 4 or 5 years of preparation in one form or another before that.
And that's ultimately given you a sort of a 4-year jump on your major rivals and staff who launched their sort of suite of paywalls a few months ago. What is it that you, as an organisation, sort of learned, or how does it fundamentally alter the kind of journalism you make and what you do with it once that paywall is out there? Yeah,
there's several aspects to it. One is actually talking to the journalists. Some love their stories behind the paywall, some don't. That's just natural. Some would love a mass audience, whereas
the sort of impact journalism idea, right?
Yeah, and others see the benefit of it being behind the paywall because your story actually stays on the homepage for longer. You actually get as many views as a free story. So there's kind of discussions going on all the time around, the differences. And there's actually human decisions still being made about what is paywalled and what isn't. And that will sometimes depend on if it's a quiet news day and we do need something exclusive to lead the site, it will come out from behind the paywall. And so that's kind of a real-time decision-making being led by the content chiefs in the newsroom. But by and large, what it has led to under the direction of both Miriana Alexander and Murray Kirkness, we're a great team. We've got a great newsroom. And over time, what it has led to is deeper analytics about the types of stories that are working well. Obviously, there's all the free breaking news and developing stories that continue to happen, and that's still vital for that mass audience. But over time, we've come to learn some of the subject matters that work really well and which enable us to carry out some deeply engaging journalism. And that's whether that's in the business space, sport, politics, and of course, opinion. Opinion forms a big part of our premium menu.
Do you, there is a criticism, I've certainly voiced it from time to time, about the sort of mismatch of the kind of news.com.au type, very clickable stories sitting alongside these quite, sophisticated pieces of premium reporting. And, I know, for example, that, in Western Australia, they have, I think it's the Western Australian and Perth Now, they basically just created two brands because they felt like they could never square that circle. And it is a bit atypical for a news brand. Do you, let's talk to you as a media insider, do you see that's a valid critique, or can you imagine a stage where there is actually a sort of an attempt to kind of, at the very least, serve a kind of highbrow premium homepage to your logged in users versus the kind of, the very Meghan Markle-y kind of approach that's the free stuff?
Yeah, so there's a couple of points there. So personalisation will play a big part of that discussion, but we've pulled out of the news.com agreement now, which is good, or they pulled out because they want to build their own kind of business model.
That's interesting. Has that been reported?
Well, there you go, you got a scoop. So you won't see news.com material anymore. We pulled out of the Daily Mail deal about 5 years ago. So, but a mass media website like the Herald still has to have a fine balance of, Murray Kirkness often talks about fruit and vegetables, but we also want the ice cream and, the sweet stuff as well.
Yeah.
Lifestyle and entertainment plays a hugely important part of that. But all of it needs to be, whether it's behind the paywall or not, it needs to be well written, premium content, like what you guys do.
Yeah. Well,
it's thankfully now we've also, inked a new deal, which is fantastic as well. But we've got a great lifestyle and entertainment team who will pull together the Royals coverage. We've got partnerships with the likes of R Media as well. So there's really great content coming from within the business and with our partners to balance that harder-edged kind of premium business and political. In terms of then, is there the opportunity to deliver just a premium business? Of course, we've invested and bought Business Desk in the last couple of years, so that plays a huge part of NZME's subscription strategy.
Yeah.
The Herald itself, I think, with personalisation and recommendation, if you're a C-suite member of the C-suite at, say, Air New Zealand, what you're being served up is on the Herald homepage will be slightly different to what maybe somebody sitting in a lounge in Te Awamutu is reading.
I feel like sometimes I get the lounge in Te Awamutu feed, but I'll just have to speak to the subs desk about that. So let's just talk now about the Media Insider. This, firstly your decision to step down and then to step into this new kind of identity that has, as for people working in the media, this is must read kind of times, like quite popcorn kind of. There's a real kind of culture around it. Tell me what drove the decision, and then the idea to focus on the business, the broader business.
Yes, I'd been managing editor for 8 years, and I went to Michael Boggs, our CEO, earlier this year, and I could see, that there were another tough year ahead in terms of, and I just needed a change. I needed a refresh. I took my cue from you, actually, in terms of your own move, but also others as well. And I think we've seen quite a few changes at the top of our media companies in the last few weeks and months. And I get it. We've had, I remember at the end of 2019 telling the newsroom, we'll never have a busier news year. We'll never, this will be a once in a lifetime.
David Bowie died.
Yeah, well, and all sorts of things, sporting events and unfortunately the mosque shootings and so forth. That was a massive news year.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we get to 2020 and, all of our lives were upheaved. And that's just been the same every year since. And so I just thought, time for a change for me personally. I think it would be good for the newsroom to have refreshed leadership. But I loved the business. And I said to Michael, I proposed the role of editor at large based on, a lot of other similar roles around the globe and locally. I hadn't quite figured out the media column. I sort of said to Michael, I'd like to, one area I do, know a little bit about is media. Maybe there's an opportunity there, but it wasn't really until the first 2 or 3 columns that I thought, I better start doing this every week.
Really?
It wasn't really put down on paper as a kind of. I said to Michael, look, I can commit to a couple of really good, decent pieces a week. I've also got some other strategic things I have to be doing for the business as well, which is important to balance that. But Media Insider's kind of, I love doing it. It's,
you can tell.
It's such an interesting phase of, the ever-changing landscape is just right now, just about every media business is undergoing some form of transformation or change. And by and large, they're willing to talk about it. And, and yes, it impacts people and it impacts personalities. I'm trying to make it a column where people obviously can trust me to talk to them, whether that's on background or, up front, and to try and also make it of interest to the wider public. So yes, I'll try and have personalities in there and a kind of a hook, if you like, to make it of broader interest, but also get into the business of journalism. Trying to do a little bit of marketing and advertising, but I'm kind of still got my training wheels on there as well. So, I'm meeting contacts all the time in those industries. I think there's an opportunity for an advertising insider column, or a marketing insider column. These industries are rich with people who are doing great things. I'm really optimistic about our media industry, but I do know that it's a tough time at the moment. Obviously, we've experienced that ourselves at NZME, and all the other media companies are the same.
I mean, one of the things I think it does very well is in focusing on a broad definition of media in the local sense. I think it makes the case for the sort of socio-cultural power of domestically created media and professionally made domestically created media versus the kind of maelstrom of social and user-generated content, and says that there is something different here. And just because, some of the media companies or people in government might say, well, this is just audiences or this is just, an advertising rate. I think what you do with that is say, actually, think about the kinds of people who consume these different types of media, what, their power, the way that it influences them. And I that's a sort of an undercurrent of it, but I think it really matters, and it's actually a benefit to the whole industry, even though at times I'm sure there are people, and we'll get to it, who don't love everything that exists in the column. Was that sort of flow on both narrowly for NZME, but also more broadly for the industries that are captured by it? Was that part of the thinking too, that it would kind of remind people that it's still here and it actually matters in a quite specific way?
Yeah, totally. And look, we've had media columns off and on over the years, and I know how well read they were and so forth. And I did see a gap there. And I think there are lots of interesting things going on. You know, there's change going on all the time, but there's, you know, huge amounts of innovation and inspiration as well. So I want to tap into a lot of that. I mean, you write about a lot of this yourself, Duncan, with your columns. And so, you know, I actually think there's so much interest in the media generally, and that's from the wider public as well. But also, you know, I love talking about the people. I don't want it to be gossipy. I know Rick Neville, one of my old mentors, gave me a rap over the knuckles a few weeks ago. Reckoned it was too gossipy, and he was probably right, you know, in terms of. But it needs to be a balance. It's got to
be fun, right?
It's got to be a balance of personalities, but also I'm trying each week to have 2 or 3 core business type pieces, or you know, deeper and meaningful pieces, if you like. So, but yes, I'm also told I've overwritten it too many times and I need a good editor to cut me back. So
I've heard people say that. I personally disagree. I'm like, I just need more. Yeah. It could stand to be 5,000 or 6,000 words. That's my feedback. One thing that is kind of has been present in it off and on from the start, and you had an absolute scorcher of a gossipy scoop early on, was Gongate at Stuff. And I just wondered if you could kind of talk a bit about how you manage the fact that one of your, you know, the Stuff newsroom seems to be quite leaky towards you at the moment, and that kind of slightly queasy thing where you are writing about a direct competitor of the paper that you're publishing in, and the inevitability that, you know, were you to apply the same rules to the Herald newsroom, which I'm sure, you know, you get information about all the time, you know, how do you sort of manage that conflict yourself personally?
Yeah, it's a careful conflict. I think, you know, yes, there's been a fair few stories about Stuff in the last few weeks, but I've also, you know, I wanted to interview Laura Maxwell about her new role and, you know, what she hoped to achieve, and she graciously did that. That was great, and talked about the changes at the top. You know, and look, I've got to give a shout out to the rest of the NZME newsroom here, because, you know, one advantage of a media column is that you've basically, in the case of NZME, I've got 330 contacts basically sitting alongside me, if you like. And so they've been really generous at feeding me information as well. It's not just all coming through, you know, to me directly. So I'm very lucky in that respect, and a lot different to other columnists. So there's no shortage of content. I've got to be careful with the NZME in the sense, you know, I'm still coming out of that exec role where I was privy to a lot of strategic information. And so my ethics on both the journalistic and as a leadership side mean that I can't go near that stuff at the moment or ever. But if there's new information that I find out about through the business, and you know, I'll absolutely, it's fair game, and the company knows that, and the newsroom knows that. And that's really important. I've written, you know, some of the challenges that NZME's facing around, you know, in what it's announced at its annual shareholders meeting. So I think, you know, that's a matter of explaining the role of journalism, both internally and externally, and why NZME is as much, you know, to be written about as anyone else. And if I'm not writing about NZME, others will be, I'm sure. But certainly with the Stuff leaks, you know, I've got a lot of friends at Stuff. I've worked alongside a lot of their leadership team in the past. There's nothing personal about it. We all realise transformation is happening, and that from time to time newsrooms will leak. I remember when we were having our big changes in the early 2015, 16, I was getting a lot of calls from rival media about all these horrible changes going on.
I mean, so the thing that really strikes me both about the column and your writing more generally, you know, I like the way that you sort of very happily, shamelessly, well, if it's a good idea from anywhere, you'll just just go and grab it. Lunch with the FT is now lunch with Shayne Currie in New Zealand, for example. Yes. One good text is one good text. Yes. But you seem to be really, really loving it. Like there's a kind of a palpable sense of almost joy out of the column in particular, but also you just look at the sheer volume that you create. It sort of feels like 2 or 3 reporters in one, which I'm sure you'll be bringing up with Michael. And,
I'll let him know you said that.
And Murray when you're next negotiating a contract. But yeah, are you? Is it as much fun as it looks?
Yeah, it totally is. And I do need to watch that I don't overwrite. I had Kim Knight in my ear the other day and that as well. I've got the newsroom around me who are keeping me in check a little bit. So it's a great newsroom. It's great actually being back out in the newsroom. I can finally understand what is going on in the business. But no, it is a lot of fun. It's good to reconnect with a lot of old contacts. It's actually good to get out of the newsroom and be kind of a shoe leather reporter at times and meet the people who, are at the forefront of change or, I've been doing a fair few business profiles aside from the media column. The lunch is fun. The lunches are a lot of fun. All sorts of different people, and I'm keen to carry those on. They're not weekly, but I certainly want to sort of make them a regular appearance. And you're right, shamelessly, stolen from the FT in terms of a format. Nowhere near as well written as the FT's ones, but
it feels like they get months to put those things together. Like, come on.
But yeah, it's a lot of fun. And One Good Text, I made sure that with One Good Text that Ben Smith was the very first subject, given he invented the format and the technique. He was very gracious to answer it.
It also just shows off your contact book in a way. It's a flex. So before we go, I just want to kind of get your perspective on a couple of bigger kind of media industry stories, I guess, that have kind of preoccupied me in this podcast in our industry. The first being the sort of impact of the public interest journalism fund on some of the things that you referred to earlier on the trust in the media and perceptions of how the actual business is conducted. And I think I saw, was it you and Mary, like sort of addressing some of that in like a live reader session, potentially at one point. What has, for a bigger organisation like yours, how did that, how do you think that went in the end, reflecting on it now?
Yeah, the PIJF fund is now finished. I look back on it now and just think, why was it ever badged as public interest journalism? NZ On Air, of course, as we all know, has been funding not just RNZ, but a lot of media companies, including our own, for many years on different projects and interesting journalism stories and so forth. And so suddenly, as a result of COVID, the specialised fund was kind of badged, and I think that was the worst mistake. Followed up by the fact the industry itself, we didn't sell it and so it allowed the conspiracy theorists to go down a pathway that just should never have existed, saying that the government had some kind of editorial control or direction over our journalism and content. Absolute rubbish. I'm just sad that opposition politicians picked up that line as well. It just was not helpful for the industry. I've said the line many times, I'll say it again now, that if any of our journalists, editors felt that they were being influenced by the government, there'd be a walkout. Our newsroom wouldn't be staffed.
It's also just proportional to the scale of the revenues of the industry. 50 million over 3 years, pretty minor. Really.
We're talking.
If we're going to sell out,
percentages.
Let's make it $1 billion. All right, if we're going to be under someone's control. Quickly, the Google News Showcase deals, which you signed relatively early on in completely uncontroversial circumstances, and no one ever made comments to the International Press Gazette anonymously about that, to be clear. Recently, you've seen Melissa Lee make statements that this is effectively a tax in another guise, and kind of essentially looking at the piece of legislation which is ongoing, which effectively will only be triggered if these deals were to lapse. I personally think that's quite misguided, and that this legislation is pretty much mission critical for a sustainable journalism in New Zealand now. What would you say to the likes of Melissa Lee or opposition politicians who maybe haven't been as engaged with that process?
Yeah, I just encourage Melissa to get alongside Michael Boggs as soon as possible and understand the business economics here. It's all well and good that early deals have been done, but the industry most definitely needs legislative backup to help us in future. And that's not just the Google and Metas, by the way. Already some of the big overseas media corporations are, quite rightly talking to Google and Microsoft about AI.
Absolutely.
And we're talking billions here. The deals so far, I think, some of the scope's been announced, but we most definitely need that legislative backup, and the sooner all politicians from all parties recognise that, the better. And I think, there's a job to be done there to educate them.
Yeah, and you sort of go, like, do you want to have coverage of Parliament? Would you like people to know what you do?
Some of them might not, but, but we most definitely, as we know.
As a society, Duncan, I think we do. Oh,
totally.
Yep.
And, that comes back to some basic journalistic principles, doesn't it?
It does. Lastly, where do you think all this is heading? You just touched on the AI stuff. That's been a big preoccupation of mine on this podcast this year. I sort of go back and forth about whether I've sort of paid too much attention to it, and but fundamentally, as you alluded to earlier, there is a great sense of change kind of flowing through the news media and the media more broadly, and it feels like there's an unusually wide vector between a kind of a scenario where we are all just fully digitally transitioned and the work is high quality and finding its audience, versus one where there's just a continual erosion of revenues and audiences and platforms that kind of say one thing and then move their behaviours, as we've seen most prominently with Facebook. You said earlier you're optimistic. What is the case for optimism about the local media?
Well, we dropped a really good nugget at our annual shareholders meeting earlier this year, and that our premium subscriptions can now fund our newsroom on their own. The revenue that we get each year can fund our newsroom. And we're just at very early days still of premium digital journalism, and we think the size of the market is quite actually large in New Zealand for digital subscription. So I'm optimistic on that front. I'm optimistic about what I see at different media companies and the transformations happening at the likes of TVNZ and the business plan that they've got in terms of, on demand and streaming services around, and the types of content that they're already producing. I think TVNZ Plus is superb. I think that there's great people leading the charge in different media businesses around that quality and trust, including our own, including the Spinoff, and others. It's in our hearts. Our principles are dear to us, and we did a lot of work last year on our own code of conduct and quality and trust. I do think, yes, we've come through 3 or 4 years of a very polarised society. I think there will still be forever people on the outer boundaries, but I think there'll be fewer people on the outer boundaries. I think there will be kind of more people coming into the centre and relying on good quality, in-depth journalism.
I hope you're right. Hey, Shayne, thanks so much for agreeing to come on The Fold. And, I'm sure I speak for many listeners of this podcast when I say that we're eagerly awaiting tomorrow's, as we record this edition of Media Insider. So no pressure. You just got to keep those scripts coming. You better go write it. Thanks so much for coming
Duncan.
in.
Thank you.
That was The Fold, brought to you by our partners at oOh!media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. Huge thanks to oOh!media for sponsoring this episode of The Fold and enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.